Hot air balloons might look peaceful drifting through the sky, but not every ride ends with a picture-perfect landing. Sometimes, what starts off as a fun, scenic adventure turns into a total nightmare. In this video, we're diving into some of the most tragic hot air balloon accidents that have ever happened. These aren't just freak accidents. They're stories that'll make you think twice before hopping into a basket and floating off into the clouds. Buckle up, because these are the 5 worst hot air balloon deaths ever. On February 26, 2013, in the ancient city of Luxor, Egypt, a peaceful sunrise hot air balloon ride turned into the deadliest ballooning disaster in history for 19 people. It's the kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience people dream of, but for 21 passengers that morning, the dream turned into an absolute nightmare. The balloon lifted off just after 7 a.m. It belonged to Sky Cruise, one of the many companies offering tourists an unforgettable view from above. What the passengers didn't know was that this very same balloon had been in a previous accident less than 2 years earlier, and that Egypt's balloon safety regulations had slipped badly in the years following political unrest. Moments into the descent, things started to go horribly wrong. A gas leak, silent and unseen, ignited a fire near the base of the basket. Witnesses said the fire erupted just a few meters off the ground as the balloon was attempting to land. As the flames surged upward, the pilot and 1 passenger managed to jump out and survive, but the balloon, caught by a gust of wind, rose rapidly, trapping everyone else inside. Panic erupted in the basket. Smoke, flames, and screaming. 7 people jumped from the balloon midair in a desperate attempt to escape the fire. The balloon climbed higher, up to 1,000 feet. Then, in a horrifying instant, a massive explosion rocked the sky. The blast was so loud it could be heard from miles away. The remaining passengers plummeted to the earth, crashing into a sugarcane field below. By the time emergency services arrived, 15 minutes later, the scene was pure chaos. Bodies were scattered across the field. The air still smelled like burnt fuel and scorched earth. Only 2 people had survived, the pilot, who was badly burned, and 1 British tourist. 19 others died, including travelers from the UK, France, Belgium, Hungary, Japan, and 9 tourists from Hong Kong. Among the victims were couples, friends, and adventurers who had simply signed up for a beautiful morning ride. People like Joe Bampton and his girlfriend Susanna Getve, who were just 40 and 34 years old. Yvonne Rennie from Scotland died that day, while her husband Michael survived with injuries, left to carry the weight of the tragedy alone. This wasn't just the worst ballooning accident in modern history. It was the deadliest of its kind since the infamous Hindenburg disaster of 1937. What makes it even more haunting is that safety warnings had come before. Crashes in 2007, 2008, and 2009 had raised red flags. In 2009, 16 people were injured in another crash in Luxor. There had been promises of reform, improved pilot training, better equipment, designated launch zones. But in the aftermath of political upheaval, oversight slipped away. And so, what should have been a magical flight over ancient wonders turned into one of the darkest moments in hot air ballooning history. It's a chilling reminder that even the most serene experiences can turn deadly in an instant, and that behind every tourist attraction is a hidden risk we rarely think about until it's too late. On July 30th, 2016, near Lockhart, Texas, 16 people lost their lives in what would go down as the deadliest hot air balloon disaster in U.S. history. It began as a seemingly peaceful morning, one of those quiet, humid Texas sunrises that balloonists dream of. The skies were overcast, the ground still cool, and the fields around Fentress Air Park sat in a soft fog. At 6:58 a.m., a massive hot air balloon operated by Heart of Texas. Hot air balloon rides lifted off with 15 excited passengers and 1 pilot on board. The plan was a scenic 1-hour flight drifting gently above the countryside. Instead, just 44 minutes later, all 16 people would be dead. As the balloon ascended, it became clear that the weather wasn't cooperating. Thick clouds and fog blanketed the sky, drastically reducing visibility. The balloon drifted into the cloud layer, vanishing from sight even for the ground crew who had been tracking it. Other balloon operators in the area had already canceled their morning flights due to the low visibility, but this pilot decided to go ahead anyway. At 7:42 a.m., the balloon collided with high-voltage power lines, wires carrying enough electricity to instantly ignite the basket. Witnesses reported hearing two loud pops like gunshots, followed by the sickening sight of the gondola falling and bursting into flames as it crashed into a field near Lockhart. Emergency services were notified within 2 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the scene was already beyond saving. The basket was reduced to a smoldering ruin, the surrounding grass scorched, and the balloon's envelope had drifted nearly a mile away. All 16 lives were lost in the fire and impact. The passengers were everyday people, mothers, fathers, friends, and couples, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, or simply chasing the thrill of floating above the earth. Their excitement turned to terror in an instant, but the real horror emerged in the days that followed, as investigators began to piece together the cause. The National Transportation Safety Board's NTSB final report revealed an alarming picture. The pilot, Alfred Skip Nichols, had a deeply troubling record. He had at least 4 prior convictions for driving while intoxicated and had served 2 jail sentences. On the day of the crash, toxicology tests found that Nichols had multiple drugs in his system, including diazepam, used for anxiety, oxycodone, a powerful opioid painkiller, and an extremely high level of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, which acts as a sedative. The diphenhydramine level alone was high enough to produce effects similar to being legally drunk. Incredibly, despite this history and cocktail of impairing substances, Nichols was allowed to fly paying passengers. Why? Because at the time, balloon pilots were not required to hold a valid medical certificate like airplane or helicopter pilots. That meant there was no mandatory check of Nichols' mental health history, substance use, or criminal background. If the rules had been different, if he had been held to the same standards as other commercial pilots, Nichols would never have been legally allowed near the controls of that balloon. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a tragedy enabled by regulatory blind spots. For years, safety advocates had warned the FAA about the lack of oversight in the ballooning industry, pointing out the risks of allowing commercial balloon pilots to operate without medical certification. But nothing changed until it was too late. In the aftermath of the crash, families mourned publicly and pushed for reform. Heart of Texas hot air balloon rides, whose owner died in the crash, shut down operations. The NTSB issued strong recommendations urging the FAA to finally require medical checks for balloon pilots. But for the loved ones left behind, any change came too late. 16 lives, gone in the span of a few terrible minutes. Victims not only of a deadly collision but of a system that failed to keep them safe. This wasn't just a crash in a quiet Texas field. It was a devastating lesson, one written in fire, silence, and grief, that even a serene sky can become a death trap when the wrong person is given the controls and no one is watching. On August 13, 1989, near the rugged outskirts of Alice Springs in Australia's Northern Territory, 13 lives were violently snatched from the sky in a collision that turned a peaceful sunrise into one of the darkest mornings in ballooning history. It was just after dawn, 6:38 a.m., when 2 hot air balloons, part of a group drifting serenely over the vast, rust-colored outback, collided mid-air. Witnesses described one balloon rapidly ascending from below, rising too fast, too close, and then the unimaginable happened. Its envelope, bright red and black, wrapped itself around the basket of the balloon above. In seconds, a massive tear opened up, the size of a bedsheet. The wounded balloon hung in the air for just a moment, hovering, silent, before it folded in on itself and dropped like a stone. Passengers in nearby balloons could only watch in horror as the stricken craft spiraled downward from 2,000 feet. The descent lasted just 51 seconds, but to those watching, it must have felt like eternity. One tourist later said, "It fell to the ground like a streamer." Another balloon pilot frantically radioed emergency services, but by the time help arrived, the damage had already been done. The basket slammed into open scrubland between two small trees, about 16 kilometers from Alice Springs Airport. 10 of the victims were still linked arm in arm inside the basket. The other 3, thrown violently from the gondola, were found scattered in the sand nearby. All 13 on board perished, including the pilot. Among them were 10 Australians, along with a Danish man and an Italian passenger who lived in Monaco. Every one of them had stepped into the balloon expecting a breathtaking view of the outback. None would return. But the crash wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. The investigation revealed a damning series of failures. The upper balloon, which initiated the fatal contact, was flying without its mandatory instrument package. Its pilot, Michael Sandby, refused to cooperate with investigators. Worse, though both balloons had working radios tuned to the same channel, neither pilot communicated with the other. A devastating silence in the skies. The report also found that the pilot of the lower balloon, the one that crashed, had failed to properly assess the position of the other balloon before climbing. It was a fatal misjudgment in a sky that, while wide open, had become far too crowded in that single moment. Justice, however, was partial at best. In 1992, Sandby was found guilty, not of manslaughter, but of committing a dangerous act, a unique legal charge in the Northern Territory. He was sentenced to just 2 years in prison, with only 8 months required before parole. 13 people died, yet the full weight of accountability never seemed to fall. In the aftermath, regulations were tightened, surveillance improved, and ballooning in Australia changed forever. But none of it could bring back those who had perished, their final moments spent plummeting toward the unforgiving earth in a scene that haunted witnesses and investigators alike. What began as a quiet morning adventure over the outback became a deadly ballet in the sky, a reminder that even in the most serene moments, one small mistake can unleash chaos, and that in the wide open air there's no room for silence. On January 7, 2012, in the peaceful skies above Carterton, New Zealand, 11 lives were extinguished in a fiery nightmare when a scenic hot air balloon struck high-voltage power lines, burst into flames, and came crashing to Earth, marking the deadliest ballooning disaster in the nation's history. The day began as so many others had in this quiet rural town in the Wairarapa region. The weather was clear, the air calm. At 6:38 a.m., the balloon, named Mr. Big, lifted gently from the grassy fields with 10 excited passengers and a seasoned pilot at the helm. They had signed up for a 45-minute panoramic flight, hoping to greet the new day with a bird's-eye view of vineyards, farmlands, and rolling hills. The pilot, Lance Hopping, was one of the country's most experienced balloonists. With over 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a respected figure in the ballooning community, even serving as safety officer for the region's biggest balloon festival. No one doubted his skill. No one saw it coming. As the balloon traced a graceful figure 8 over Carterton, the chase crew waited below, ready to assist with landing. But around 7:20 a.m., the balloon began drifting toward danger, heading east toward a set of 33,000-volt power lines that stretched across the land like an invisible snare. Witnesses watched in disbelief as the balloon edged closer to the wires. Then, a shout broke through the quiet morning. "Duck down!" It was the pilot, but it was already too late. The basket snagged on the lines. Sparks exploded in the sky. For 20 agonizing seconds, the balloon scraped along the conductor, powerless to break free. Then came the arc, a searing burst of electricity that caused one of the gas cylinders to rupture. Flames erupted instantly. In a split second, 2 passengers made the impossible choice to jump, plunging 20 meters to their deaths below. Above them, the balloon ignited, flames clawing their way up the envelope. As the fire intensified, the balloon began to rise again. One of the power lines snapped, and Mr. Big, now engulfed, shot skyward. It reached 150 meters before the fabric gave way entirely. The balloon disintegrated mid-air. The wreckage fell like a meteor into a paddock just south of Somerset Road, 600 meters from the highway. Chase crews and families watched in horror as the sky, once filled with promise, turned into a funeral shroud. Emergency responders arrived within 7 minutes, but nothing could be done. All 11 people on board were gone, lost in a firestorm that lasted only moments but scarred a nation forever. What made it worse was what came after. Toxicology tests later revealed that the pilot had THC, cannabis, in his system at the time of the crash. The Transport Accident Investigation Commission determined that his judgment had been impaired, likely contributing to his fatal decision to try and climb over the wires rather than descend rapidly to safety. It wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a preventable one. This wasn't the first time the TAIC had investigated a transportation disaster involving drugs or alcohol. In fact, it was the 6th such case in 10 years, but this one, involving a man so trusted and experienced, shook the public faith and demanded reform. The Commission issued urgent calls for stricter drug and alcohol policies across New Zealand's aviation, marine, and rail industries. It took 2 full days for all the bodies to be recovered and transported to Wellington Hospital for formal identification. The victims had names, stories, families. There were couples, cousins, a boyfriend and girlfriend. Some were local to Masterton and Wellington, others from nearby towns. All of them had boarded that balloon expecting a quiet, breathtaking journey through the sky. None of them knew it would be their last. The balloon Mr. Big, with its bright red and yellow colors, had flown for over a decade. But in those final moments, it became the symbol of a disaster that exposed not only the fragility of life, but the cost of complacency and safety oversight. 11 lives ended in a blaze of fire and falling canvas, leaving behind only silence and the echoes of a tragedy that should never have happened. On August 23, 2012, in the quiet expanse of the Ljubljana Marshes in Slovenia, a hot air balloon carrying 32 souls, families, tourists, children, was torn from the sky by a sudden storm, killing 6 and injuring 26 more in a horrifying crash that left the nation stunned. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning flight, drifting above the lush green wetlands just south of Ljubljana. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the balloon, a massive Lindstrand LBL 600C, the largest ever flown in Slovenia, lifted off into what seemed like tranquil skies. The passengers, crammed into a 4-compartment basket stretching over 5 meters long, likely exchanged smiles and snapped photos, unaware of the storm clouds lurking on the horizon. But the weather in the marshes can change fast. And this morning, it did. Shortly before 8 a.m., as dark clouds gathered and winds began to twist erratically, the pilot realized what was coming. With little time to react, he began an emergency descent, hoping to get the balloon safely to the ground before the storm hit full force. But just as they neared the fields below, a violent burst of wind shear seized the balloon and hurled it into a stand of trees. The impact was devastating. The balloon burst into flames. Screams pierced the chaos as fire ripped through the envelope in the basket, trapping passengers in a deadly inferno. 4 people died instantly, their bodies burned beyond recognition. Among them was a family from Ljubljana, a husband, wife, and their 11-year-old daughter, alongside a 56-year-old woman. Survivors, many of them children and elderly tourists, were thrown from the wreckage or pulled from the flames by pure chance. 10 required immediate resuscitation. 2 more would later succumb to their injuries. One woman, after clinging to life for 2 weeks in a Ljubljana hospital, and a 59-year-old man who died days later in Maribor. As news spread, the entire country seemed to stop. That same evening, nearly 400 mourners gathered at St. Michael's Church on the Marshes in Črna. Candles flickered in the pews. The air hung heavy with grief. Bishop Anton Jamnik led a mass in memory of the dead and wounded, his voice trembling as he addressed a community stunned by loss. In the days that followed, the Sloven Civil Aviation Agency grounded all commercial hot air balloon flights. No one knew for how long. Operators shuttered their businesses, some permanently, families canceled bookings, public trust was shattered. An investigation by the Slovenian Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission would eventually point to a series of failures. The pilot, they said, had used improper landing techniques for the massive LBL-600C balloon, especially dangerous under the conditions. Weather planning was insufficient, they said. The sudden storm should have been anticipated, but it wasn't. The pilot, however, rejected every claim. He pleaded not guilty to causing general danger. A drawn-out legal battle followed, with emotions still raw. When the trial finally reached its conclusion in 2018, a foreign expert's testimony led the court to exonerate him entirely. But for the victims' families, and for the survivors who still carry the scars, some visible, others buried deep, that verdict didn't erase the flames they saw, or the screams they heard, or the lives they lost in the smoke above the marshes. What should have been a tranquil memory, a morning of wonder and awe over the green sprawl of Slovenia, became one of the darkest chapters in the country's aviation history. 6 lives lost, and a haunting reminder that sometimes the sky turns cruel without warning.